Good morning, or at least it's morning. I don't know how good it is, but we're here. Um, what I wanted to do was just review with you what's going to be on the test tomorrow, talk about the main ideas, which are up on the screen right now, and terms, test format, the whole works. Um, it's going to be, as far as format goes, multiple choice for several. I don't know how many yet. I have to write it. um, but it's going to be multiple choice and um, some of the relationship questions that you love so much, and also some short answer questions. It's kind of a pain in the butt to do that online, but at the same time, um, I want you to get something out of this, and just giving you an all multiple choice test to me isn't good enough. And I know you'd probably prefer that, but I don't. So it'll be a little bit of everything, similar to what we've had in the past. And we're going to cover these main objectives right here on the screen at the moment. So let's go over those. The first part one of the study guide, it's too bright. Okay, part one of the study guide called for you to detail life for African Americans in the Jim Crow South. Tired. Haven't had my Mountain Dew yet. Um, and if you remember the first part of the study guide, okay, that should come up any second now. Hello. Okay, here we go. First part of the study guide had this main idea. And some of the terms, which there are a total of 22 terms, um, all of those are fair game for multiple choice and or relationship questions. Okay. Um, the first part, we did try to get a background of what it was like under Jim Crow. Okay. So the first part of it was explain how Jim Crow laws impacted the lives of African Americans in the South. Okay. You had to talk about how everything was separate, how blacks and whites were not allowed to be together in public, and stuff like that. Jim Crow laws kind of took control. Plessy versus Ferguson was the Supreme Court case that made Jim Crow laws legal. It said you could have separate facilities as long as they were equal. Okay? Now, that's overturned, but for now, take it. That's what it is. All right? And so we talked about that in the first part. What was it like under Jim Crow? We talked about that farmer who was killed because he didn't want to sell his farm to the white neighbor. We talked about, we watched a video on Emmett Till, a boy from Chicago who came to Mississippi who was beaten to death for saying bye baby to a white woman. Okay. We saw the water fountains. Those sort of things, those images, those ideas, are all part of what makes the Jim Crow South so horrible. Okay, and I want you to remember that. And that Plessy versus Ferguson made it legal. All right. Then we got into Brown versus the Board of Education, which outlawed segregation in public schools. Now, it didn't outlaw it everywhere. That comes later, but it starts it by saying you cannot have segregation in public schools. In fact, it says, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Just by having separate facilities makes them unequal. Okay, and we talked about Brown versus the board and what it meant. And to African Americans, the Emmett Till case, they were fed up with what was going on. It happened right around the time that Brown versus the board occurred. So you have these major things, people getting fed up with the treatment. The spirit of Larry lives on in my yawns. I know, Larry, you're still okay. But uh, they were fed up with the treatment, and at the same time, there was a Supreme Court case that said, hey, segregation's illegal in schools. Maybe we could outlaw it in other areas. So it inspires African Americans to take action. Okay? But here's the trick. When we talk about why the civil rights movement happened when it did, it was a combination of all these factors. But when there was a court ruling that said segregation is illegal in schools, and none of the schools were like, all right, it's illegal, let's just open up and have all African Americans and white students together and we'll be happy. That didn't happen. So the movement comes around to force the change that was required by law in different areas. All right. And that's kind of what we get into this first section. That's what it's all about. The starting of that movement, the getting going, what this stuff means, why Brown is a big deal. Okay? You with me? If not, let me know. Comment, ask questions, send me an email, Zoom. I'm on Zoom right now as we speak. Got my Zoom going, got my video recording. Okay, maybe not. Now I screwed it up. But please ask questions if you need to. And you can use your study guides on the test, so make sure they're done. I'm talking to you, 90% of 8th hour that didn't do the last study guide. Okay, so then we look at other things like describe the methods used by the nonviolent movement, the ideas behind civil disobedience. That is when we get into part 2 of the study guide. We talked about Rosa Parks. If you watched any of the videos, I talked about Rosa Parks. And we talked about the Montgomery bus boycott. That's not showing up here for some reason. Okay. This is an early exposure to these types of strategies. Everything was segregated. They decided to test. Since they had a Supreme Court case that said segregation's illegal in schools, they thought, well, what about other places? So they took on a campaign in Montgomery. Rosa Parks is arrested on December 1st. That was not an accident, by the way. She said she would do it so they could use that as a case to test it in the courts. All right. And the community decides to enact a bus boycott. All right. And it takes about a year, but it works, and it ends segregation on buses. And these sort of things inspire other action. Okay. The Little Rock 9 integrated Little Rock Central High School. Okay. In 1957. And Martin Luther King, then, we talked about his commitment to nonviolence and this idea of civil disobedience, breaking unjust laws. Remember, we had to read his letter from a Birmingham jail. That's part of this section. It details why he did what he did. Yeah. Okay. And they formed different groups to do things like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that performs sit-ins and lunch counters like this. Okay. There were the Freedom Riders that rode public transportation, or be interstate transportation in this case, throughout the South to test the new rulings. The court said you can't have segregated waiting rooms or bathrooms at bus terminals. The South still did. So they got on buses, they rode through the South, they tried to test those rulings. Right? This is what we're talking about when we look at part 2. Okay. Come on, part 2. Don't be shy. Come on, there you are. When it talks about describe some of the methods used by the nonviolent movement and the ideas behind civil disobedience. Some of the methods I would look for if I asked you that question on the test would be sit-ins, the freedom rides, marches, bus boycotts. Okay? Stuff that you looked at, Project C in Birmingham, where when they had the kids out and they were attacked by fire hoses and dogs and so on, that was a nonviolent march against the rules. Now, the city of Birmingham had posted, had outlawed the march and said you can't do it. They marched anyway and were arrested. And as Martin Luther King said in his letter, it creates a tension, fosters a crisis for the community so they can no longer ignore the issue. When you have thousands of people in jail, businesses downtown are being, disrupted by the marchers, you have to take notice. And that was kind of the main idea. It forces the community to take notice of the issue and do something about it. That's really what civil disobedience is all about. And all of those different actions that they took on to do that, force the issue. It's illegal, but according to Martin Luther King, it's a necessary illegal activity because those are unjust laws. And that you have to point those out and you have to do something about them. Okay, that's what part 2 is about. And you end with the March on Washington, where you got to see Martin Luther King give his I Have a Dream speech. That's a very, very important speech and very famous speech in U.S. history, where he sort of outlines his main ideas about freedom and equality. Okay, that's part 2. It also asks you to list some of the changes made at the state levels and federal levels. And I gave you a list of those 5 items. I'll show you. There was a bunch of other stuff, but I asked you to write 5. There are more than 5. Many more than 5, but I gave you 5 highlights. All right? Something like this. Okay. Plus you got the Voting Rights Act down here and the Civil Rights Act, et cetera, et cetera. But if I were to ask you to list some of those, here's what you could put down. Now, I probably won't ask you to list changes. I might use those as something else, but just know, just in case. All right? Then we go on to part 3. Now, part 3 is a little trickier, but again, I have list some of the changes made at state and federal levels. So the big thing about part 3, though, is right here. Compare and contrast the ideas and practices of Malcolm X to those of Martin Luther King and the nonviolent movement. Okay, well, I had you look at some of the frustration first. Okay, so you see things come out in the Watts riot. Watts is a neighborhood in Los Angeles, massive riot because of police brutality. Detroit, same thing. There were several others. DC, there was a riot. There were some throughout the country. Okay. We also looked at or talked about Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March. What happened then was on March 7th of 1965. The civil rights movement was going to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. And along the way, register people to vote. African Americans in the South were denied the vote for 100 years, basically. Not quite, but close to it. Okay. And one of their goals then was to register voters and try and get them to vote. The states made it very difficult to do that, and they were trying to call attention to that problem. Well, on the way out of Selma, they were met by state police and beaten severely. It was on the news. The whole world saw it. And it called on President Johnson. By that time, President Johnson, Kennedy was killed. His vice president, Lyndon Johnson, was now president, to do something. And he made a speech about pushing for voting rights. And for 2 weeks, then they sat in Selma, the civil rights leaders, trying to figure out, how they could keep going on this march. And on March 21st, they were allowed to actually start the march, and they did. And they marched to Montgomery and protested the Capitol and everything. But again, it was police brutality against these nonviolent demonstrators that angered the nation. So you start to see this frustration. The guy that represented that frustration was Malcolm X. Malcolm X, if you remember, former criminal, this guy, okay, former street hustler, goes to prison, and he converts to Islam with a guy that he meets in prison, and he starts learning all sorts of things he never considered when he was younger, and starts to then push for an end to injustice once he gets out of prison and becomes a member of this group called the Nation of Islam. Now, a lot of you guys who didn't watch the video that I posted before kind of had a little simplistic view of what Malcolm X was all about. If you watch the video, what I basically said is that he was not against violence, but he wasn't really violent. He didn't encourage it. He just said if you're hit, you should hit back. If you're attacked, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to defend yourselves. Martin Luther King, on the other hand, said, you just take it. You take a beating, you don't fight back. They even trained for it in those, like for the sit-in demonstrators, they trained to be nonviolent. So they would have people pretend to beat them up and call them horrible names and resist the temptation to fight. Malcolm X said, why? No one's asking the whites in the South to be nonviolent, so why are they asking blacks in the South to be nonviolent? So he was more militant, as they'd say, civil rights leader, but still wasn't really violent. He just said that African Americans should develop their own communities, take care of themselves, have their own businesses, their own schools, and not really mix with whites. And that's where he's pretty much different from Martin Luther King. Okay, so that's going to be on the test. I'm not going to ask you specifically about Stokely Carmichael and Black Power, but it is one of the terms. So all 22 terms are fair game. And then the last thing that was in the unit was the assassination of Martin Luther King. On April 4th, 1968, he's killed. It doesn't end the movement, but it's without a leader, a definitive leader for a while, and it slows it down. But there you go. All right, so let's take a look at the objectives one more time. Okay. Detail the life of African Americans in the Jim Crow South. You'll have to be able to explain what Jim Crow is like. Not a person, set of laws. Explain the significance of the events like Brown decision on the beginning of the civil rights movement, right? It gave them hope. It showed that the courts might be friendly to their cause. Combined with some other frustrations that sort of boiled over in 1955, you have action start to take place, right? Describe the methods used by the nonviolent movement. That's the sit-ins, the marches, the freedom rides, the etc. Okay? List some of the changes made at the state and federal levels. The big ones, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They desegregated lunch counters and buses long before the law in 64 said they had to, because the movement took action. Okay? And then the last one is compare and contrast the ideas and practices of Malcolm X to those of Martin Luther King and the nonviolent movement. All right? So those are the big ideas that I will be writing a test all about. Everything on the test will be related to these ideas. There might be terms that you have to know. There are 22 terms. Again, each part of the study guide has its own set of terms that adds up to 22. Those are fair game. All right. And there'll be some multiple choice and some relationship questions based on those terms. Okay. Essay questions, if there are any, like the short answer versions, they're all going to be based on these big ideas. All right. So I would say be prepared to answer questions on at least a few of these. Okay. Test tomorrow. I will put it on Classroom. It's going to be a Google form like the last one. You won't get a grade until I look at your written answers, but it'll be there. So I will try to put a test help segment up on Classroom as far as giving you some sample questions and some hints here pretty soon. But that's about it. So hopefully you watch this video and it might help you. And if not, good luck on the test anyway. So see you later.